Took me about 2 days to do the job and 2 people to do it. I started by jacking the car up on 2 jack stands so the car was even and not twisted, and I could get underneath it to get to the power steering pump when I needed to. I waited till the engine was cool before I took any bolts out of it. And I started by taking off this beauty shield. Next, I took off the plenum cover. Took off the air filter and tube that goes to the throttle body. Undid the battery cables inside the car. Then undid the positive terminals here. Took the cover off. I undid the 2 bolts, went around the outside bottom part of the fuse box, lifted it off, and undid the cables underneath, the plugs, place it off to the side. The fuse box mount plate, which is here, there's 3 bolts that held it on, and that came off also. Removed the power steering reservoir and the rubber tube here, and I put a bolt in each end, in the reservoir and in the tube, so the oil won't leak out. And completely removed the reservoir and placed this tube off to the side. Removed the engine mount that mounts to the fender. Removed the upper coolant outlet line after I drained the engine coolant. Removed this AC line that runs all the way down across the fender to the back firewall. Took this AC line and I placed it underneath this piece of plastic, and I tied a string that went from this hole over to my hood latch just to hold it out of the way, so I had enough room to get my timing cover out. Disconnected all of the vacuum lines, the wiring harness, and all of the clips on the front of the engine or near your passenger fender. Disconnected all the sensors. There's 8 of them. Removed all the posts on the plenum to take the felt cover off. Undid the 5 bolts on top and 1 over by the throttle body. To remove the plenum, the air intake, and I stuffed nice clean rags inside the intakes, as so no dirt and debris or any tools would fall inside. I drew a picture of how my drive belt was installed so I could put it back together the same way, because it is confusing. Power steering pump, water pump, crank pulley, tensioner, AC compressor, idler, alternator. I then removed the drive belt tensioner, the alternator and idler pulley at the same time. Removed the water pump, pulley, and then the water pump. The crank pulley came off next, and that's where I needed a hand. That bolt is extremely tight. To get the bolt off, I found this in my toolbox. It's an old slide pulley that I had made, or you can stack up some blocks of steel because it's a very tight bolt. And I put this on my lower control arm slash frame area with a pin on top inside the crank pulley, one of the 3 wings or arms. So here's a picture of the crank pulley, and I had this pin right there underneath one of the arms, resting on top of here. And as I put pressure holding it up, my partner undid the bolt. And this probably took us a good 10 minutes to do. It is extremely tight. I did not have a flywheel lock, so this is how I went about it. So I put it in till it hit the timing cover, then backed it off a little bit, and then we proceeded to undo the bolt. Before taking my crank pulley off, I measured it. So here's my crank pulley, here's my crankshaft, and my crank pulley was sticking out past the crankshaft by 50 thou. That's 5/100ths of an inch. So that way when I put this back on, it stayed at the same distance. The only pulley I could get to work was a 3-inch, 3-jaw puller. That's the only one I could get to fit. When I went to disconnect my power steering pump, which is near the firewall at the bottom of the engine, I could see one of the bolts from the side, but I couldn't get to the second one, so I had to crawl underneath the engine, underneath the car, to roughly about the middle of the car and look back at the power steering pump to get to the second bolt. I undid that bolt and just left my power steering pump floating there. From there, I went and removed my spark plug coils. I did not replace my spark plug coils. I put them back in the same spot, so I labeled them 1 through 6 for the coil into the plug. Remove the coils, then I removed my spark plugs, and I put clean shop rags in the spark plug tubes, again so nothing would get inside, dirt, debris, or tools. They are long, deep tubes. I proceeded to remove the valve covers, both front and back valve covers. Once that was done, I took a piece of string, wrapped it around this wiring harness, and tied it over to this hood rest post, just to keep all the wiring off to the side, to give me as much room on the front of the engine or the right side of the car to work. On the timing cover, there are 8 sensors. 4 of them need to be removed. I made a little map in case I was going to take all of them out and I wanted to put them back in the same spot. But I ended up only removing 4. I removed the 2, 3, and the 6 and the 7. So the top 2 stayed in, and the top 2 stayed in on the right bank and the left bank. And the 2 middle ones on each bank were removed, and they are roughly 4 to 5 inches long. Those I had to take out so I could get the timing cover out. I didn't want to damage them. It would have been just way too hard to take the timing cover off with those in. So I found my timing cover had a few extra bolts than the book I have for the car shows. So I undid all the bolts on the timing cover, and there are a lot of them, over 20 of them. And there are 2 small ones that my book didn't show, 1 large one, and then one that is the same as the other 20, but it's just slightly longer. So I had to keep track of where these bolts belonged. Most of them are all the same length, except for the one that's just slightly longer is the one that I had to really pay attention. And that was like roughly in the middle of the right bank part of the engine. So it's fairly easy, but I had to just keep an eye on which bolts were coming out and how long they were. Once I was ready to take my timing cover off, I took a pry bar on the bottom and along the top and just lightly pried. I made sure that I didn't hit any mating surfaces or anything that would distort. I didn't pry on the cam phasers, just on anything solid. I believe there's a 10 mil bolt that I could have used right near where the water pump is, and it helps where you can crank, and it helps pry the center of the timing cover off. I didn't need to use that. I just went around the outside edge and just gave it some light push, and eventually broke the seal, and the timing cover came off nicely. Once the timing cover was loose, I brought it up, and the V part of the timing cover I placed right in towards this plastic and spun it up and out. So I popped it off, brought it up, and I spun it up and out of here. Hence why the AC line's got to be tucked under and your coolant's got to be gone. You need a lot of room, as much room as you can get to spin it out. It wasn't very bad. It went in fine and came out fine. Once the timing cover was off, I took shop rags, or like these. These are what I used to cover the intakes and the spark plug tubes. And I took about 3 or 4 of these and I placed them right underneath the crank on the opening of the oil pan, because I didn't want any of the gasket when I cleaned it off to fall in there, or any tools, because I did drop my 10 mil socket quite a few times. So that's what I did. I covered the oil pan where the oil drains into from the timing cover with shop rags, and then when I removed them, I made sure that I had the 4 that I put in, I took out 4. That way I know one didn't fall in. Once I was ready to do my timing chains and the guides and the tensioners, I put this bolt back in the crank shaft, tightened it down, and I gave it a couple shots with my impact gun, as I had to rotate the engine from first stage to second stage to first stage to do all the timing chains. So I put this in and gave it a couple shots with the impact gun just to make sure that it wouldn't come loose when I was cranking over to first and second stage timing. Once I had the bolt in and tightened down with my impact gun, I cranked the engine around from my crank until my timing marks were on the tops of the cams. As you can see, this is roughly where my timing marks were. So for the right bank, there was an R roughly in this area and an R in this area. And on my left bank, there was an L roughly here and an L roughly here. Now what messed me up a little was there was an R on this cam phaser also. I couldn't find this L until I wiped it off of the metal cover that's on the phaser. That's where the L was marked. So this one took me a little while to find, but I did crank the engine, and hence why you take your spark plugs out, so there's no compression and you're not skipping teeth and there's no pressure on the cams. So I cranked it around till my timing marks were roughly at the top. And on the oil pump, my timing mark was roughly here and here. There was two timing marks on my oil pump. I purchased my timing chain kit from a distributor of cloys. Took me a little while to find it because some places wanted almost 3 times the amount that I believe Cloys was suggesting to sell it for. So it took me a little while, but I ended up finding a distributor, and I ended up getting the Cloys timing kit. This is the one I wanted. I didn't want to cheap out and go with a no-name brand. From what I understand, it's a reputable company, and I wanted to give them my business because they have an awesome installation video on YouTube. This is what I used when I got to this point to do my timing chains. They have a really good video, explains the torque specs, explains how to do the process from your Mark 1 to Mark 2. So thank you, Cloys. And here are all the pieces that came off. When I went to do it, I took the chains. I took all the new chains and the new sprockets. So the chains and the sprockets are the only thing I soaked. I'd gotten fresh oil and put it in a can, and I soaked the chains and the sprockets for, I don't know, maybe a couple hours. That way when I did my startup, everything was lubricated and a little easier on the chains. So once I triple checked all my markings before I cranked my engine around, I triple checked, made sure all my markings lined up, everything was spaced accordingly. I took a ratchet and I cranked my crank bolt roughly 4 revolutions. 2 reasons. One, someone suggests that it'll build pressure in the tensioners, in the chain tensioners. And secondly, the main reason I did it was to be sure that none of my cylinders, my pistons, hit my valves. So once I made roughly like 4 revolutions, I was confident that nothing would hit my valves, and I proceeded to put the car back together. My helper, before I took the tensioners off, I placed, I believe they were 3/4 open-end wrenches on my camshafts. So when I undid the tensioner, he held them in place just to be sure that they wouldn't jump and how far they jumped, in case there was any pressure from the springs. And I undid the tensioners, and he slowly relieved it and kept track of which way it went and everything. It moved very minimal, maybe maybe one of the camshafts moves maybe 5 to 10 degrees, which was no big deal because with the open-end wrench, when I went to put the chains on, they went on fine. Just adjusted it with the open-end wrench, and he held the chains on in place as I put the guides and the tensioners on. Once I had the tensioner on, he let go of them, and all was well. And we did that to all 3 chains. So my helper I needed to hold the chains on, it's a lot of work to go up and down. He held them on from the top, and I went underneath the car and put the tensioners and chains and everything on. From there, once I was happy with all the timing marks lining up and I gave my engine the revolutions and I felt comfortable to put everything back together, I did make sure that all my mating surfaces were clean, from where the timing cover goes to my valve covers. I took a razor blade, and that's all I did was take a razor blade and clean everything off. I did do what Chloe suggested, and here is the guide that goes on the oil pump. I just took the plastic piece off and replaced it in the engine. One thing I did run into was the bolts for the guides and the tensioners. This is what the bolt looks like. Right there, that's what the bolt looks like. These bolts were tighter than what the torque specifications say. I don't know if it's because the engine was heated and cooled so many times with the drive cycles, but these bolts were very tight, and I wish I had known, because I would have bought new ones. As we were putting the last guide on, that happened. This bolt broke inside the engine. I did get lucky, because when it did break, this portion of the bolt was sticking out of the engine roughly 1/8 of an inch. So just enough that I could get pliers on there to twist it out. Being as this was done on a weekend, nothing was open to get these bolts. So, lucky for me, I had access to socket head cap screws. These bolts are very well built. I replaced the timing guide bolts with these ones here. Metric bolt. Very lucky. So I wish I had replaced all the bolts with these, but I did not know. On the timing cover, I replaced the seals that go around the 4 sensors or that we removed earlier. Put those back in, and my crank pulley seal also. This one was tough. I had to pound it out from the back. As you can see, it's all distorted. And when I put it in, you want to put it in evenly, and I got lucky because the slider that I had made and found earlier fits perfectly. So this is what I used to hit it back in with my rubber mallet. Place that on there and hit it back in. And what I did with this is, prior to taking it out, I measured how deep this was inside my timing cover, and I put it back in the same position, which I believe was 50 thou also, recessed in. When I did the other seals, I used a flat block and put it on top, just so that way I was hitting it in evenly also. This was the gasket maker I used for my timing cover. I used Permatex Blue RTV gasket maker. And how I did this was, they suggest a 2 mil bead around certain areas and 5 mil around others. So I just did a 5 mil bead all the way around, around the water pump area and all the bolts. And it suggests that you put the bead on, place the timing cover on, and when placing the timing cover on, be sure not to knock it around. That's where my helper came in again to help me guide it in and make sure I wasn't getting the RTV all over the phasers and chains. So we hugged the wheel well and placed it on with a couple bolts, and you start tightening the bolts down until the sealant starts to ooze out. Then we stopped and waited about an hour, hour and a half, and then finished torquing it down. They must have changed the design of the valve cover seals. The new valve cover seals have this area here is completely shut off except for two little holes. My valve cover on the right bank looked like a barbecue, the bottom of a barbecue. It was just covered in black. It took a lot to clean it out. There is a little valve on the top of the cover, like a release valve or an exhaust valve, and you couldn't even see it. It was completely covered. So I made sure to clean that all off and replace the seals that went around it. And like I said, they must have had a redesign. And before putting the valve covers on, you want to make sure that all surfaces are clean, and where your timing cover mates up to your engine block, there was gasket maker that oozed out the top. You have to clean that to where it transitions from the timing cover to your valve cover surfaces. And when I went to go put my valve covers on, they suggest putting a little bit of sealant, where this is the area where it transitions from the timing cover to the valve cover. Put a little bit of sealant on that joint before you put your valve cover on. And that's what I did. And on my valve covers, the kit came with these little rubbers that hold the screws in place, and when you torque it down, they compress. So in combination with using the Cloy's video that's on YouTube and my Haynes manual is how I went about doing this job. I have the Haynes manual for every one of the vehicles that I own and have previously owned. When I buy a vehicle and this book comes out, I'm sure to get it. This book I used for all my torque specifications and processes of how to remove certain things, such as your oil pump with the bolt that you can't see. So I did not use the Haynes book for the actual timing portion of the job. I used the Cloy's. So the Haynes went from disassembly to Cloy's for the timing, and back to Haynes for assembly, due to the fact that they have all the timing specs in here and orders of operation, I guess. So this really helped me out also. Here's a little list of the parts that I used. So I had to purchase a water pump gasket, a valve cover gasket, or gaskets, iridium spark plugs. This engine does run hot, so I bought iridium spark plugs, timing cover gaskets, which comes with the crank seal and the seals for the sensors, and another water pump gasket that goes on the inside of the timing cover, which looks like that. Water outlet gasket and seal. So there's a gasket, an irregularly shaped gasket, and a round seal that goes on the water outlet on the top of the engine. The blue RTV sealant to create your seal, and the new crank bolt. So you shouldn't use the same crank bolt. You should replace your crank bolt. So some of the tools I used, it's a little list I had made, has the parts also, but I used a 3-inch 3-jaw puller. That's the one I found would fit. The RTV sealant, valve cover gasket kit, timing cover gasket, water pump gasket, upper engine coolant outlet, 1 ring and 1 irregular seal. Crank pulley installer. I used a crank pulley installer. I wanted to be sure that the crank pulley went on evenly. I didn't really want to use the bolt, so I used that. I did not replace the spark plug coils. Those were quite expensive, and I was trying to save money. I figured if I needed to replace them later on, it's not too hard to get to. It's just underneath the plenums. It's nice because you're already there, but I just replaced the spark plugs instead of the coils also. And I did replace the spark plugs. So that's pretty much it. I had a heck of a time getting the crank pulley off and put back on. That was tough to put it back on. Let's see if I can find it. To put the crank bolt back on was tough. The book suggested something like 70 odd foot-pounds. Yeah, I think the book suggested like 74 foot-pounds or something like that. And this came into use again. So once I was ready to put my bolt on, I rotated my crank pulley till one of the supports there, fins, whatever, was just above the right side, 90 degrees. So I backed it off there. I placed my support here on the frame and put my pin in again while holding it while my partner torqued it down, and it was like 160 degrees of torque, or not torque but rotation needed after it was torqued down to the 74 foot-pounds. So that's what we did. We torqued it down, placed the pin in, being sure that the pin didn't hit the timing cover, and then gave it the rotation that the book, the Haynes book, suggests. And that was hard too. That was quite tough. And then after that is when the rest of the assembly went on. So that's how I did it. Two things I was happy I had was the Haynes book and the Cloy's video.